Welcome to this journey into the forgotten darkness of America's past. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Drop a comment below. There's something deeply unsettling about hearing these stories late at night, when the world outside falls silent and the shadows grow longer. This community thrives on sharing these moments together, so let us know. Tonight, we travel to Mississippi. The year is 1884. The American Civil War has been over for nearly 2 decades, but the South still bears its scars. The grand plantations that once symbolized wealth and power now stand as monuments to a dying era. Among them, nestled in the dense forests of Lafayette County, stood Willowbrook Plantation, home to Christian Brown, a man whose name would become synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases in Southern Gothic history. Christian Brown was 52 years old in 1884, a widower since 1878. When his wife Margaret succumbed to yellow fever, he lived on the estate with his 2 adult children, Claire, 28, and Edmund, 25. To the outside world, the Browns were a respectable, if reclusive, family. Christian maintained profitable cotton fields, employed local workers, and attended Sunday services at the Presbyterian Church in the nearby town of Oxford. But in the spring of 1884, something changed at Willowbrook Plantation. Christian Brown commissioned the construction of a peculiar annex at the rear of the main house. He hired builders from 3 different counties, ensuring no single crew understood the full scope of the structure. He paid them generously to work quickly and to ask no questions. The annex was completed in merely 6 weeks. The building had no windows facing the main property. Its doors were reinforced with iron bars, and most peculiar of all, Christian Brown ordered every entrance to be fitted with locks that could only be opened from the outside. The servants whispered among themselves. Claire Brown grew increasingly withdrawn, spending hours staring at the annex from her bedroom window. Edmund began drinking heavily, often found wandering the property at dawn, his clothes disheveled, his eyes haunted. Then came the sounds. On quiet nights, when the wind died down and the cicadas fell silent, people began to hear them. Voices, women's voices, coming from the sealed annex, not singing, not laughing, crying, pleading, and sometimes late into the night, screaming. The key. Townspeople of Oxford began to talk. Farmhands working the neighboring properties reported seeing lamplight moving through the annex windows long after midnight. A traveling salesman claimed he heard a woman calling for help as he passed by the plantation gates. The local pastor, Reverend William Thornton, paid a visit to Christian Brown, expressing concern for the family's well-being. Christian received him cordially. He explained that he had taken in a distant cousin, a widow who had fallen on hard times and suffered from severe melancholia. She required privacy and constant care, he said. The sounds people heard were simply her episodes of distress. He assured the Reverend that a private physician visited regularly. The explanation satisfied some, but not everyone. Claire Brown stopped attending church. She stopped visiting town. By summer's end, she was rarely seen at all. And then, on the morning of October 3rd, 1884, Claire Brown vanished. Edmund discovered her absence at breakfast. Her bed had not been slept in. Her wardrobe remained full. Her jewelry sat untouched on her dresser. It was as though she had simply evaporated from existence. Christian Brown reported his daughter missing to the Lafayette County Sheriff, Thomas McKinley, that same afternoon. A search was organized immediately. Dozens of volunteers combed through the forests surrounding Willowbrook. They dragged the nearby creek. They searched every building on the property, every building except one. Christian Brown forbade the searchers from entering the annex. He claimed it contained only his late wife's belongings, items too precious and painful to disturb. Sheriff McKinley, respecting the grieving father and prominent citizen, agreed to honor this request. The search continued for 3 days. No trace of Claire Brown was found. On the 4th day, something happened that would crack open the terrible truth festering at Willowbrook Plantation. Edmund Brown stumbled into Oxford's main street at dawn, covered in dirt and blood. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were wide with terror. He collapsed in front of the general store, and when the townspeople rushed to help him, he could only repeat 3 words over and over again. The woman, the chains, the rooms. What Edmund Brown had discovered in those pre-dawn hours would reveal a horror that challenged comprehension. But before we delve into those revelations, we must first understand how Willowbrook Plantation became a house of nightmares, and how Christian Brown transformed from respected gentleman into something far more sinister. To understand the darkness that consumed Willowbrook, we must first understand the world that created it. The Mississippi of 1884 was a land caught between 2 eras. The Old South, with its grand plantations and rigid hierarchies, was dying. The New South, struggling toward industrialization and reconciliation, had not yet been born. In this liminal space, isolated estates like Willowbrook existed almost as independent kingdoms, subject to little outside scrutiny or control. Christian Brown had inherited Willowbrook from his father, Nathaniel Brown, in 1868. The plantation had survived the Civil War relatively intact, though its fortunes had diminished considerably. The Brown family had owned over 200 enslaved people before emancipation. By the 1880s, Christian employed approximately 30 workers, mostly freedmen and their families who had nowhere else to go, trapped by debt and limited opportunities. The main house was a 3-story Greek Revival mansion built in 1842. White columns supported a broad veranda. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees formed a canopy over the long approach road. Behind the main house lay the old slave quarters, mostly abandoned by 1884, slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and forest undergrowth. Christian Brown had married Margaret Fairchild in 1853. By all accounts, it was a marriage of social convenience rather than affection. Margaret came from a wealthy Natchez family and brought a substantial dowry. She bore Christian 2 children, Claire in 1856 and Edmund in 1859. Historical records paint Margaret as a reserved, melancholic woman. The Fairchild family had a documented history of what was then called nervous disorders. Margaret's mother had spent the final decade of her life in a private sanatorium in Louisiana. Margaret herself suffered from what period documents describe as episodes of profound melancholy and religious mania. After the war, Margaret's condition worsened. She became convinced that God was punishing the family for past sins. She stopped eating regularly. She would lock herself in the chapel room for days at a time, praying until her voice gave out. Christian hired a series of nurses to care for her, but Margaret refused most treatment. In August 1878, during a particularly brutal yellow fever outbreak, Margaret Brown died. The official cause was listed as fever, though some local sources suggest her weakened state from self-neglect contributed significantly to her inability to fight the illness. Claire and Edmund were 22 and 19, respectively, when they lost their mother. Claire had been educated at home by private tutors, as was customary for young women of her class. She was described by those who knew her as intelligent but painfully shy, rarely venturing beyond the plantation grounds. She had no suitors, no close friends, no life, independent of Willowbrook. Edmund had attended the University of Mississippi for 2 years before being withdrawn by his father in 1877. The reasons remain unclear, though letters from that period, preserved in the university archives, suggest Edmund had developed a drinking problem and accumulated significant gambling debts. He returned to Willowbrook and took on the role of overseeing the day-to-day operations of the plantation, though by most accounts, Christian maintained tight control over all significant decisions. In the year following Margaret's death, Christian Brown changed. Workers on the plantation later testified that he became increasingly withdrawn and volatile. He dismissed long-term servants without explanation. He began taking frequent trips to Memphis, New Orleans, and Jackson, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time. He also began corresponding extensively with various institutions. Letters found years later revealed communication with hospitals, asylums, and charitable organizations across 3 states, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. In these letters, Christian presented himself as a philanthropist interested in the welfare of unfortunate women, particularly those suffering from mental afflictions. He offered to provide private care for select patients, women who had no family to care for them, who had become permanent residents of overcrowded institutions. He proposed removing them to the peaceful rural environment of Willowbrook, where they could recover away from the noise and chaos of institutional life. Several institutions took him up on his offer. The first woman was transferred to Willowbrook in the winter of 1879. Her name was Sarah Jane Morrison, a 34-year-old widow from Vicksburg who had been committed to the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum after attempting to take her own life following her husband's death in a riverboat accident. The asylum was desperately overcrowded. Christian Brown's offer to provide private care seemed like a blessing. Sarah Jane Morrison was released into Christian Brown's custody on December 14, 1879. She was never seen again outside of Willowbrook Plantation. Between 1879 and 1884, records show that at least 7 women were transferred from various institutions into Christian Brown's care. All were between the ages of 28 and 42. All had been diagnosed with various forms of mental illness, from melancholia to hysteria to what was termed moral insanity. Most importantly, all were women with no living family members, no one who would come looking for them. The institutions were grateful. Overcrowding was a constant crisis. Christian Brown was providing a service, or so they believed. He paid for their transport. He signed all the necessary documents. He provided quarterly reports on their progress, always stating that the patients were improving under his care, but still required continued isolation for their own safety. No one from these institutions ever visited Willowbrook to verify these claims. Meanwhile, the plantation continued its quiet existence. Cotton was harvested, crops were sold. Christian Brown maintained his reputation as a respectable if eccentric member of the community. Claire and Edmund lived their isolated lives, rarely questioning their father's activities. But isolation has a price, and in places like Willowbrook, where walls are thick and nearest neighbors are miles away, where power is absolute and accountability is absent, darkness can grow unchecked. The construction of the annex in spring 1884 marked a turning point. Christian Brown was no longer content with secrecy. He was expanding his operations. The new building, according to the original construction plans that would be discovered later, contained 12 separate rooms, each approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, each with its own lockable door and barred window. Claire had grown suspicious by then. She had found one of her father's journals in his study, containing detailed notes about the women under his care. What she read in those pages horrified her. She confronted Edmund, who admitted he had known about the women for years, but had been too afraid of their father to speak out. Claire decided to investigate the annex herself. That decision would lead to her disappearance and trigger the unraveling of Christian Brown's carefully constructed facade. But before we reveal what Claire discovered and what ultimately happened to her, we need to understand the sounds that haunted Willowbrook's nights, the testimonies that would later emerge, and the true nature of Christian Brown's charitable work. Tell us in the comments what you think was happening inside that annex. What was Christian Brown really doing with those women? The first concrete testimony about the annex came from an unexpected source, a 9-year-old boy named Samuel Jackson, son of Robert Jackson, one of the plantation workers. Young Samuel had a habit of wandering the Willowbrook grounds, exploring the forests and abandoned outbuildings. On the evening of June 12, 1884, approximately 4 months before Claire's disappearance, Samuel was playing near the old slave quarters when he heard something that stopped him cold, a woman's voice, singing. The voice came from the direction of the new annex. It was a hymn, Samuel would later recall, Rock of Ages. But the voice sounded strange, broken, as though the woman was singing through tears. Samuel crept closer to the annex, hiding behind a thick magnolia tree approximately 30 yards from the building. As the sun set, he watched lamplight appear in several windows. Then he heard more voices, multiple women talking in low, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but the emotion was unmistakable. Fear. Then another sound cut through the evening air. Footsteps, heavy boots on wooden floors, a man's voice, sharp and commanding. Christian Brown. Samuel watched through the twilight as Christian emerged from the rear door of the main house, carrying a large tray covered with a cloth. He unlocked the annex door using a ring of keys and disappeared inside. Moments later, Samuel heard the women's voices rise in what sounded like pleading. Then came the screams. Samuel ran home and told his father what he had witnessed. Robert Jackson, a prudent man who understood the precarious nature of his employment, warned his son never to speak of it again. But the story spread among the workers nonetheless. 3 weeks later, on July 4th, a local farmer named Eugene Pritchard was driving his wagon past Willowbrook late at night, returning from Independence Day celebrations in Oxford. As he passed the plantation gates, his horse suddenly stopped, refusing to proceed. Pritchard climbed down to investigate and heard what he would later describe as the sound of multiple women weeping, like a choir of ghosts. Pritchard later testified that he stood at the gates for nearly 5 minutes, listening. The sound seemed to emanate from a building behind the main house. Occasionally, the weeping would be interrupted by the sound of metal scraping against stone and low, guttural moaning. Deeply unsettled, Pritchard urged his horse forward and left as quickly as possible. The next day, he mentioned the incident to several men at the general store. The story reached Reverend Thornton, who, as mentioned earlier, paid his visit to Christian Brown shortly afterward. But perhaps the most damning pre-disappearance testimony came from Dr. Albert Henshaw, Christian Brown's personal physician. Dr. Henshaw had been treating the Brown family for over 15 years. In September 1884, just weeks before Claire vanished, Christian summoned him to Willowbrook on an emergency call. Christian claimed that one of his patients in the annex had taken ill with influenza and required immediate attention. Dr. Henshaw arrived at dusk. Christian met him at the annex door, holding his ring of keys. The doctor later provided a sworn statement describing what he witnessed during that visit. Upon entering the annex, Dr. Henshaw was struck by the oppressive atmosphere. The building was divided into a long central corridor with doors on either side, each door fitted with heavy bolts and padlocks. The air was stale and carried an unpleasant odor of unwashed bodies and human waste. Christian led him to the third door on the right. Inside, Dr. Henshaw found a woman lying on a narrow cot. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, gaunt and pale, but what disturbed him most was her condition beyond the influenza. Her wrists bore deep bruises and abrasions, consistent with restraints. Her hair had been roughly shorn. Her eyes, though feverish, held a look of absolute terror. When Dr. Henshaw attempted to speak with her, asking her name and how she felt, Christian immediately intervened, claiming the woman was non-verbal due to her mental condition. The woman opened, her mouth as if to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. As Dr. Henshaw examined her, he heard sounds from the other rooms, whispers, movement, at least one woman crying softly. He asked Christian how many patients were currently residing in the annex. Christian's answer was vague. "Those who need my care," he said. 6, perhaps 7 currently. Dr. Henshaw prescribed medication for the influenza and left. But the visit haunted him. The woman's injuries, the sounds from the other rooms, the oppressive secrecy. He later stated that he considered reporting his concerns to Sheriff McKinley, but hesitated, lacking concrete evidence of wrongdoing beyond suspicious circumstances. That hesitation would become one of Dr. Henshaw's deepest regrets. Meanwhile, inside the main house, Claire Brown was conducting her own investigation. Claire had found her father's journal in his study on August 23, 1884. The journal was leather-bound, locked, but Claire had discovered the key hidden in her father's desk drawer. What she read in those pages would have chilled anyone's blood. Christian had documented everything: the names of the women, their arrival dates, detailed descriptions of his experiments in treating their conditions. But these were not medical treatments. They were systematic torture masked as therapy. He described restraining women for days at a time to calm their hysterical tendencies. He wrote about forced starvation as a means to humble the rebellious spirit. He detailed his belief that women's mental afflictions stemmed from their inherent weakness and sinful nature, and that rigorous physical discipline was the only true cure. Most disturbing were his notes about Sarah Jane Morrison, the first woman brought to Willowbrook. Christian had become convinced that she was possessed by evil spirits. His treatment methods had become increasingly brutal. The final entry about Sarah Jane, dated March 1882, simply read, "Patient expired during corrective treatment, buried in the south garden." Claire copied several pages from the journal in her own hand. She showed these pages to Edmund, who confirmed that he had suspected the true nature of their father's activities, but had been too frightened to act. Christian's temper had grown violent over the years. Edmund had witnessed his father strike workers who questioned him. He had seen Christian's eyes grow cold and dead when angered. The siblings agreed they needed proof beyond the journal. They decided Claire would attempt to access the annex while Christian was away on one of his trips. On September 28th, Christian departed for Jackson, claiming business with his cotton broker. He was expected to be gone for 3 days. Claire waited until the first night. Shortly after midnight, she took a lantern and Christian's spare ring of keys, which she had secretly duplicated weeks earlier. Edmund stood watch at the main house as Claire approached the annex. What Claire discovered inside that building would never be fully known. She never had the opportunity to tell anyone, because Christian Brown had not gone to Jackson. He had suspected his daughter's investigation and set a trap. He was waiting in the annex when Claire unlocked the door. Edmund Brown waited for his sister through the long night. When dawn broke on September 29th and Claire had not returned, panic seized him. He ran to the annex and found the door slightly ajar, the duplicate keys lying in the dirt outside. He called Claire's name. No response. The building stood silent. Edmund entered the corridor. His lantern illuminated the narrow hallway with its series of locked doors. The silence was absolute. Too absolute. He walked slowly down the corridor, checking each door. All were locked from the outside. Then he reached the door at the end of the hall. It was open. Inside, Edmund found a larger room that served as Christian's private office within the annex. A desk covered with papers, medical instruments hanging on the walls, leather restraints, syringes, bottles of laudanum and chloroform, and on the desk, Claire's shawl. But no Claire. Edmund frantically searched the room. He called her name again and again. He pounded on the walls, thinking there might be hidden passages. And then, beneath the desk, he noticed something. A trap door. The wooden panel was nearly invisible, fitted perfectly into the floor, but one corner was slightly raised, as though it had been recently opened and not properly closed. Edmund's hands shook as he gripped the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor opened to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. A wave of cold, fetid air rushed up, and with it a sound. Faint, distant, someone weeping. Edmund descended into what would be described in later reports as a subterranean chamber, part of the old plantation's original foundation. The space had been converted into a series of cells, carved into the earth itself. The stone walls wept with moisture. Chains hung from iron rings embedded in the rock. In the first cell, Edmund found a woman. She was huddled in the corner, her dress torn and filthy. When Edmund's lantern light fell on her face, she screamed and tried to press herself further into the corner. She was approximately 30 years old, with matted dark hair and eyes that reflected pure animal terror. Edmund attempted to speak to her, to assure her he meant no harm, but she only screamed louder. He moved to the second cell, empty, but the chains showed signs of recent use. The third cell contained another woman, this one older, perhaps 40. She didn't scream when she saw Edmund. Instead, she laughed, a broken, mad sound that echoed off the stone walls. She kept repeating a name, Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane is in the garden. Sarah Jane is in the roses. The fourth cell was also empty. The fifth cell contained what Edmund would later struggle to describe to investigators, a woman so emaciated she barely seemed human. She lay motionless on the stone floor, and for a moment Edmund thought she was dead. But then her eyes opened. Blue eyes, sunken but aware. She whispered something Edmund couldn't quite hear. He knelt closer. "What? What did you say?" The woman's cracked lips moved. "She took the key. The girl, she went deeper." "Deeper? What do you mean, deeper?" The woman's skeletal hand pointed to the far wall. "The old passage. To the quarters." Edmund hadn't noticed it at first, but there was indeed another. Opening in the wall, partially concealed by shadows. A tunnel. The tunnel was barely 4 feet high, forcing Edmund to crouch as he moved through it. The walls were dirt and timber, shored up with old wooden beams. This was part of the plantation's original construction, dating back to the 1840s, when the house was built. These passages had once connected the main house to the slave quarters, allowing masters to move unseen through the property. Christian Brown had found these tunnels, and he had put them to use. Edmund emerged in what had once been the basement of the slave quarters. The structure above had collapsed decades ago, but the foundation remained intact. Christian had reinforced it, created new spaces, built a second hidden prison. And there, in the center of the largest chamber, Edmund found his father. Christian Brown stood beside a stone table. Upon the table lay Claire, unconscious but breathing. Christian held a syringe filled with clear liquid. Father and son stared at each other in the lamplight. "She discovered too much," Christian said calmly, "just like you are about to." Edmund turned and ran. He ran through the tunnel, through the subterranean cells where the imprisoned women screamed at his passing, up the stone steps, through the annex, across the grounds. He ran until he reached Oxford's main street, where he collapsed in front of the general store, covered in dirt and blood from scraping against the tunnel walls, his mind shattered by what he had witnessed. The woman, the chains, the rooms. Those were the only words he could speak. Sheriff Thomas McKinley organized a proper search party within the hour. 20 armed men, including Dr. Henshaw, Reverend Thornton, and several concerned citizens, rode to Willowbrook Plantation. They found Christian Brown on the front veranda, calmly smoking a pipe, as though he had been expecting them. When Sheriff McKinley demanded to know Claire's whereabouts and insisted on searching the property, Christian smiled and said, "Search wherever you like, Sheriff. You'll find I've done nothing illegal. Those women in my care are patients, assigned to me by legal institutions. I have all the documentation." The sheriff and his men entered the annex first. What they discovered shocked even those who had suspected the worst. The main level contained 12 small cells, as the construction plans had indicated. 9 were currently occupied. The women inside were in various states of physical and mental distress. Some cowered in corners, some didn't react at all to the intrusion of strangers. One woman, identified later as Mary Catherine Dupree, age 38, transferred from a Louisiana asylum in 1881, could only rock back and forth, humming tunelessly. The cells contained only narrow cots, chamber pots, and heavy chains attached to the walls. Some of the chains showed bloodstains. The walls bore scratch marks, as though someone had clawed at them desperately. In Christian's office room, they found meticulous records, ledgers documenting each woman's arrival, daily observations, treatment protocols. The treatments ranged from prolonged isolation to ice baths to forced medication with laudanum and other sedatives. Several entries described physical punishments for disobedience or manifestations of evil. Then Edmund, who had somewhat recovered his composure, led them to the trapdoor. The sheriff and 6 men descended into the subterranean chambers. The 3 women Edmund had seen were still there. The emaciated woman had lost consciousness. Dr. Henshaw immediately began emergency treatment while others explored further. They found the tunnel to the old slave quarters. They emerged in the underground foundation space where Edmund had encountered his father. The stone table remained, but Claire was gone. Christian was gone. And there was a third exit from the chamber, a vertical shaft with an iron ladder leading upward. The shaft emerged in the woods, approximately 200 yards from the main plantation buildings, concealed by thick brush. Fresh footprints led away through the forest, 2 sets, 1 adult male, 1 being dragged. A tracker named James Whitfield, who had served as a scout during the war, examined the trail. "They're headed toward the river," he concluded, "maybe an hour's head start." Sheriff McKinley divided his forces. Half remained at Willowbrook to secure the scene and care for the imprisoned women. Half rode toward the Tallahatchie River following the tracks. They never found Christian and Claire Brown. The trail disappeared at the river's edge. There was no sign of a boat, no indication of which direction they might have gone. Christian Brown, intimate with every inch of Lafayette County, had vanished into the wilderness. Back at Willowbrook, the full scope of the horror was still being uncovered. Searchers found a diary in one of the underground cells, hidden beneath loose stones. It was written by Sarah Jane Morrison, the first woman Christian had taken. The entries spanned from December 1879 to March 1882. Sarah Jane had documented her captivity in heartbreaking detail. She wrote about the initial deception. Christian had seemed kind at first, promising her a peaceful recovery in a country setting. The horror had begun gradually. First, he restricted her movements for her own safety. Then came the restraints, then the punishments, then the systematic torture justified as medical treatment. Sarah Jane had tried to escape twice. Both times Christian had caught her. The punishments that followed were described in graphic detail. She wrote about other women being brought to Willowbrook, hearing their screams, knowing they suffered the same fate. Her final entry, dated March 18, 1882, read, "I cannot endure another day. Tonight I will provoke him. I will force him to end this. Death is preferable to one more moment in this hell. If anyone finds this diary, know that we tried to survive. We tried to hold on to hope. But he took everything from us, everything. May God forgive me for welcoming death." The searchers also discovered the south garden that the madwoman had mentioned. Beneath the rose bushes, they found disturbed earth. Excavation revealed human remains. Sarah Jane Morrison's body was identified by a distinctive silver locket she had worn, described in the asylum's intake records. But Sarah Jane was not alone in the garden. Over the following days, they unearthed 8 more bodies, all women, all in various stages of decomposition. 9 women dead, 3 women rescued alive from the underground cells, 9 women from the main annex, traumatized but physically intact. 21 victims in total, 21 women that could be verified. As the rescued women slowly recovered under Dr. Henshaw's care and that of nurses brought from Memphis, some began to share their stories. Martha Grayson, age 31, who had been brought to Willowbrook in April 1883 from a Tennessee hospital after a diagnosis of hysteria following a miscarriage, described Christian Brown's methodical cruelty. "He believed he was saving us," Martha told investigators in a written statement, her hands still shaking too badly to write herself, so a nurse transcribed her words. "He said we were possessed by demons of female weakness. He said pain was the only purification. Every morning he would read scripture to us. Then he would choose one of us for treatment. The treatments, Martha explained, varied. Sometimes it was simple starvation, isolation in complete darkness for days. Sometimes it was physical punishment, beatings justified as driving out sin. Sometimes it was forced immersion in ice-cold water until the woman lost consciousness. The worst," Martha continued, "was when he made us hurt each other. He would tell one woman that if she didn't strike another, both would be punished more severely. He wanted to break not just our bodies, but our spirits, our humanity." Caroline Hayes, age 34, from a Mississippi asylum, had been at Willowbrook for only 4 months. She had maintained more lucidity than some of the others. Her testimony provided crucial details about the plantation's operation. "There were rules," Carolyn stated. "Never speak unless spoken to. Never look him in the eye. Never ask questions. Women who broke the rules went to the cells below. Some never came back up." Carolyn confirmed that Christian had told them all the same story. They had been released from the asylums into his care legally. Any attempt to escape would result in their return to the institutions, where they would be locked in cells far worse than anything at Willowbrook. He had convinced many of them that no one would believe their stories, that they were already deemed mad by society. "And he was right, wasn't he?" Caroline said bitterly. "We were discarded women, no families, no advocates, the perfect victims." Perhaps most chilling was the testimony of Elizabeth Worth, age 42, the emaciated woman Edmund had found in the 5th cell. Elizabeth had been Christian's captive, the longest of the survivors, since January 1880. Elizabeth's mind had been badly damaged by her ordeal. She could only communicate intermittently, often drifting into unresponsive states. But in her lucid moments, she revealed that Christian Brown had not always acted alone. "The son knew," Elizabeth whispered to Dr. Henshaw during one examination. "The boy, Edmund. He knew from the beginning. He brought us food sometimes. He never helped us. He just watched." This revelation sparked a manhunt for Edmund Brown as well, but he had disappeared from Oxford shortly after leading the sheriff to the underground chambers. Some believed he had fled to avoid prosecution. Others thought he might have gone searching for his father and sister. Edmund's role in the crimes remained ambiguous. Some workers testified that they had seen Edmund appear distressed, drinking heavily, avoiding the annex. Others claimed he had been seen entering and leaving the building multiple times. The truth lay somewhere in the shadows. The women from the main annex, who had not been subjected to the worst of Christian's underground prison, provided additional context. They described Christian as a man who believed himself righteous. He quoted scripture constantly. He saw his captives not as victims, but as patients he was saving from damnation and madness. Rebecca Stanton, age 29, stated, "He told us he was doing God's work. He said women were weak vessels that needed strong guidance. He believed the asylums were failing us, that only he understood the proper treatment." The investigation expanded beyond Willowbrook. Authorities contacted the institutions that had released women into Christian Brown's care. The responses ranged from shock to defensive denial. Some institutions claimed they had followed all proper procedures, that Brown had provided references and credentials. Others admitted that overcrowding had led to insufficient vetting of those who offered to take patients. The Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum Superintendent, Dr. Marcus Webb, was forced to resign after an investigation revealed he had released 7 women to Christian Brown over 5 years without ever visiting Willowbrook to verify their living conditions. Dr. Webb had accepted Christian's quarterly reports at face value, never questioning why. None of the women ever recovered enough to be released back into society. The scandal sent shockwaves through mental health institutions across the South. Reforms were called for. Oversight committees were established. But for the women of Willowbrook, these changes came far too late. As autumn turned to winter in 1884, the search for Christian and Claire Brown continued. Posses scoured the countryside. Telegraph messages were sent to every town and city within 500 miles. Wanted posters bearing Christian's likeness were distributed across 3 states, but it was as though father and daughter had been swallowed by the earth itself. Some speculated that Christian had murdered Claire and disposed of her body in the river, then fled alone. Others believed Claire had been complicit in her father's crimes and the pair had escaped together. A few even whispered that Claire herself was still alive somewhere, held captive by her father in some new secret location. The truth, whatever it was, remained elusive. Sheriff McKinley conducted one final search of Willowbrook's grounds in December after the first frost. His men excavated every inch of the property where the earth appeared disturbed. They tore up floorboards in the main house. They drained a decorative pond near the rose garden. They found 2 more bodies in unmarked graves near the tree line. Both were severely decomposed, impossible to identify. The total count of confirmed dead rose to 11. But they found no trace of Claire Brown. On December 28, 1884, the Lafayette County Courthouse held an inquest into the deaths at Willowbrook Plantation. The surviving women testified, though many were still too traumatized to provide coherent accounts. Dr. Henshaw testified about the conditions he had witnessed. Workers from the plantation described the sounds they had heard, the strange comings and goings, their suspicions, and their fear of speaking out. The jury's verdict was unanimous. Christian Brown was guilty of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and torture. A warrant was issued for his arrest, with a reward of $500 for information leading to his capture. The warrant was never served. Christian Brown was never found. As 1884 drew to a close, Willowbrook Plantation stood empty. The main house, the annex, the underground chambers, all were sealed by court order. The surviving women were transferred to a newly established facility in Memphis, one that promised genuine care and rehabilitation. The property itself became a monument to horror. Locals avoided it. Stories spread about ghostly voices echoing from the empty buildings, about figures seen moving through the windows at night, about an overwhelming sense of sorrow that hung over the grounds like a shroud. Claire Brown's disappearance haunted the community most of all. She had been a victim of her father's madness, certainly, but had she also become something more in those final moments? Had she died trying to save the imprisoned women, or had she died because she had finally seen her father's true nature? The questions remained unanswered as winter deepened and the old plantation sank into silence. The Willowbrook case faded from public attention as the years passed, but it never truly disappeared. Like all profound traumas, it left echoes that reverberated through generations. In 1923, nearly 40 years after the events of 1884, a history professor from the University of Mississippi named Dr. Henry Caldwell became interested in the case. He had grown up hearing whispered stories about the horror at Willowbrook and decided to conduct a proper historical investigation. Dr. Caldwell managed to track down several surviving witnesses. Most of the primary figures were long dead, but some peripheral characters remained alive, their memories still sharp. He interviewed Martha Grayson, then 71 years old, living in a quiet home in Arkansas. Martha had never fully recovered from her ordeal. She had never married, never had children, never truly escaped the shadow of those months in Christian Brown's captivity. "I still dream about it," Martha told Dr. Caldwell. "Every night I'm back in that cell. I hear the others screaming. I hear his footsteps in the corridor. Then I wake up, and for a moment, I don't know where I am. It takes me a while to remember I'm safe now." Martha revealed something she had never told investigators in 1884. In the weeks before the discovery of the underground chambers, she had heard Christian Brown speaking to someone in his office at the annex. The voice that responded was female, but it wasn't one of the captive women. It was young, educated, refined. It was Claire. She was arguing with him, Martha recalled. "I couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. She was angry, disgusted. He was trying to explain himself, to justify what he was doing. Then I heard what sounded like a struggle. Something fell. Claire cried out. Then silence." This testimony suggested that Claire had confronted her father before the night of her disappearance, that perhaps the final confrontation in the underground chamber had not been their first. Dr. Caldwell also discovered something in the county archives that had been overlooked in 1884. A land deed dated October 15, 1884, transferring ownership of a small property in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas from Christian Brown to a C. Ashworth. No, one named C. Ashworth could be located in Arkansas records, but the timing was suggestive. The deed had been executed just 12 days after Claire's disappearance and Christian's flight. Had Christian planned his escape route in advance? And who was C. Ashworth? Dr. Caldwell traveled to the Ozark property, a remote cabin in the mountains near the town of Jasper. The cabin had burned down in 1891, leaving only a stone foundation. Local residents remembered it had been occupied briefly in the mid-1880s by a reclusive man and his invalid daughter, but they had disappeared suddenly, and no one had thought much about it. The man was older, grey-haired, one elderly resident recalled. Kept to himself. The girl was sickly, never came out. Some folks said she was simple-minded, others thought she might be his prisoner, but you know how mountain folk are. We mind our own business. Dr. Caldwell's investigation yielded no definitive answers, but it raised tantalizing possibilities. Had Christian Brown hidden in that cabin with Claire, keeping her captive until he decided what to do with her? Had she died there? Or had she eventually escaped, perhaps taking on a new identity, living out her days in anonymity? In 1957, another fragment of the story emerged. A construction crew, demolishing the remains of Willowbrook's main house to make way for new development, found a hidden compartment behind a false wall in what had been Christian Brown's bedroom. Inside were dozens of daguerreotypes and early photographs. Most showed women. All appeared to be taken at Willowbrook. Some were innocent enough, portraits taken in the garden or on the veranda, but others were disturbing. Women in restraints, women with visible injuries, women with expressions of absolute terror. Among these photographs was one that generated intense speculation. It showed a young woman, approximately 25 to 30 years old, standing in front of the Ozark cabin Dr. Caldwell had investigated decades earlier. The photograph was dated on the back, June 1887. The woman's face was turned partially away from the camera, making positive identification impossible. But she wore a distinctive cameo brooch that matched descriptions of one that had belonged to Claire Brown. Had Claire survived her father's captivity? Had she lived for at least 3 more years after her disappearance? The photograph raised more questions than it answered. In 1982, a woman named Dorothy Tremaine, age 84, contacted a Mississippi Historical Society with an astonishing claim. She stated that her grandmother had been Claire Brown. According to Dorothy, her grandmother had escaped from Christian Brown in 1889 after 5 years of captivity. She had made her way to Texas, assumed a new identity, and eventually married. She had never spoken of her past, even to her own daughter, but had left a sealed letter to be opened only after her death in 1949. The letter which Dorothy provided to researchers described in Claire's own handwriting her years of imprisonment. After the night of her disappearance, Christian had kept her drugged and isolated, moving her from location to location. He had been convinced that Claire, like the other women, needed his treatment to purify her spirit. The letter described Christian's descent into complete madness in those years. He believed himself a prophet, chosen by God to cleanse the world of female corruption. He spoke of visions and divine mandates. He grew increasingly paranoid, certain that authorities were closing in. In March 1889, according to the letter, Christian had died suddenly of what appeared to be a heart attack. Claire, still weak but no longer drugged, had fled. She had walked for 3 days before reaching a town where she had told authorities she was a widow traveling to relatives. She had never revealed her true identity, terrified that she would be blamed for her father's crimes or institutionalized. Herself, she had built a new life, raised a family, and carried the terrible secret until her death. Historical experts examined the letter extensively. The handwriting matched samples of Claire's writing from before 1884. The details about Willowbrook and the Brown family were accurate, but definitive proof remained elusive. DNA testing was discussed, but proved impossible. Claire's body had been cremated in 1949, and no samples remained. Whether Dorothy's grandmother was truly Claire Brown remains a subject of historical debate. Some accept the letter as genuine, others believe it was an elaborate hoax or the delusions of a mentally ill woman. The truth, like so much of this story, remains obscured by time. One final discovery came in 1998, when ground-penetrating radar technology was used to survey the Willowbrook property, which had become a public park. The scans revealed additional underground chambers that had never been excavated in 1884. Archaeologists carefully excavated these spaces and found 3 more sets of human remains, all female, all consistent with women who would have been adults in the 1880s. They also found hundreds of personal items, jewelry, clothing, letters, diaries. Among these artifacts was a silver locket containing a miniature portrait of Claire Brown. The locket had been buried approximately 6 feet deep in a chamber directly beneath what had been Christian Brown's office in the main house. Was this Claire's final resting place? Or had someone buried the locket as a memorial? Once again, the evidence proved frustratingly ambiguous. The remains were given proper burials in Oxford Cemetery. A memorial plaque was erected, listing the names of all the confirmed victims of Christian Brown's crimes, with Claire Brown's name at the end, followed by a question mark. Today, more than 140 years after the horrors at Willowbrook Plantation, the case remains one of the most disturbing and enigmatic chapters in American criminal history. The facts we know are terrible enough. Christian Brown imprisoned, tortured, and murdered at least 11 women, possibly many more. He exploited systematic failures in the mental health system to acquire vulnerable victims. He operated with impunity for years, his crimes hidden behind walls of respectability and isolation. But the questions that remain may be even more haunting than the answers we have. What was the true fate of Claire Brown? Did she die on the night of October 3rd, 1884, murdered by her father to silence her revelations? Did she survive years of captivity before finally escaping to build a new life in anonymity? Or does her body still lie somewhere undiscovered, another secret the land refuses to yield? And what of Edmund Brown? He vanished as completely as his father and sister. Some believe he was complicit in Christian's crimes and fled to avoid justice. Others see him as another victim, so traumatized by his discoveries that he could no longer function in society. A few even speculate that Christian murdered Edmund as well, eliminating the only witness who could lead authorities to his hiding place. The most disturbing question, perhaps, is one of scale. Christian Brown operated openly for 5 years, from 1879 to 1884. But he had the infrastructure, the connections, and the methodology to have been active much longer. Were there victims before 1879? Are there more bodies buried on the Willowbrook property, in places that have never been searched? Did Christian Brown have accomplices, other men who shared his twisted beliefs and helped facilitate his crimes? We may never know the full extent of the horror. 3 theories have emerged over the years, each with its advocates and its evidence. Theory 1. The death theory. This theory holds that Claire Brown died on the night of October 3rd, 1884, likely murdered by her father to prevent her from revealing his crimes. Christian then fled alone, possibly dying in the wilderness from exposure or injury, his body never found. The photograph from 1887 is explained as either misidentified or deliberately falsified. The letter from the woman claiming to be Claire is dismissed as a fabrication. This theory is favored by those who believe the most straightforward explanation is usually correct. Theory 2. The survival theory. This theory accepts the possibility that Claire survived, was held captive by her father for several years, and eventually escaped after his death. The 1887 photograph is genuine. The letter is authentic. Claire lived out her life under a new identity, finally revealing the truth only posthumously. This theory is supported by those who find the evidence compelling and who want to believe that Claire, unlike so many of Christian's victims, found eventual freedom. Theory 3. The continuation theory. The darkest theory suggests that Christian Brown successfully established a new base of operations in Arkansas or elsewhere, continued his crimes with Claire as either prisoner or unwilling accomplice, and that both may have died years or even decades later, their final resting place unknown. This theory attempts to explain the long gaps in the timeline and the lack of definitive closure. It's the theory that keeps people awake at night. The truth likely died with Christian Brown, if indeed he is dead. Some still believe he may have lived into the early 20th century, a monster hiding in plain sight under a new name. What we can say with certainty is that the women who suffered at Willowbrook deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or victims, but as individuals who endured unimaginable horror. Sarah Jane Morrison, Martha Grayson, Elizabeth Worth, Caroline Hayes, Rebecca Stanton, Mary Catherine Dupree, and all the others whose names we may never know. They were daughters, sisters, mothers. They were human beings who deserved compassion and care, who instead found only cruelty. The memorial plaque in Oxford's cemetery reads simply, "In memory of the women of Willowbrook, taken from life, never forgotten." To this day, no one knows the full truth of what happened at Willowbrook Plantation. The old foundations still lie beneath the park. The tunnels still exist, sealed off but present, a hidden network of pain beneath the pleasant surface. On quiet nights, some people still claim they can hear sounds coming from the ground, echoes of suffering trapped in stone and earth. Whether those sounds are real or imagined, whether they are truly the voices of the dead or merely the wind through empty spaces, they serve as a reminder of what can happen when power goes unchecked, when society turns away from its most vulnerable, when evil finds the perfect conditions to flourish. The case of Christian Brown and the Willowbrook Plantation remains open, technically unsolved. The final chapter has never been written. Perhaps it never will be. What do you believe happened to Claire Brown? Share your theories in the comments below. This is a mystery that has haunted researchers for over a century, and perhaps our community can shed new light on one of America's darkest secrets. If you found this journey into the past as compelling and disturbing as I did, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Join our haunted community as we continue to uncover the forgotten darkness of history. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly past. Some horrors never die. They simply wait in the shadows, patient and eternal. Thank you for joining me on this investigation. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay haunted.